What I'm going to start off with just talking a little bit about is how sustainability reporting in Shell's evolved. Just a little bit of flavor of some of the metrics we've used over the last 20 years or so. Just to set a bit of context about between having metrics and between making them effective. Because that will lead into me sort of talking about, so what does make some metrics effective and actually make performance changes and others don't? I'll talk a bit more about our safety journey as a good example of where we have been able to use metrics effectively. And then I've got some other examples I can talk to depending on how I'm doing on time. And finally, coming back to some of the reporting challenges of actually answering some of these more strategic questions as opposed to providing the metrics we're actually asked for. And the distinction between you're asked for metrics which you can provide, but that's not actually necessarily answering the real questions that people want you to answer. But this is just showing the different types of reporting we've introduced in Shell over the last roughly 20 years. The line at the bottom should be the sustainability report, which we first published in 1997. And actually, in preparing for this, went back and read that first sustainability report. And it's quite interesting. In addition to sort of talking about the safety performance and safety metrics that you'd expect and oil spills in Nigeria and topics like that, it also talked about climate change. It included our CO2 emissions, methane emissions, talked about flaring and other environmental metrics like VOCs, SOx emissions, and so on. So the metrics which we're being asked for today, we've been publishing since 1997. In fact, in 1998 report, the second one, I didn't read all 20. I did limit myself to the first couple. We actually then also referenced the fact that we produced a separate report just to talk about climate change, Shell's view on climate change and what we were doing about it. So this sort of process of providing additional reporting and information is something that's been going on for a long time, but when it's been effective, when is it not? So the other lines going up is sort of showing when we started to produce separate reporting on Nigeria, on oil sands, on revenue transparency, the various other topics which have been in response to investor requests or other stakeholder requests for more information. What's been striking with some of them, things like the revenue transparency, lots of call for the information, but since we published it, you don't get questions. And that just suggests that we're still not getting the right link between what the concern is, what's asked for, and what we provide. And how to close that loop is a continuing challenge. The first couple of points are probably quite obvious. Good metrics, they need to be understandable. I think everybody would feel that was fairly straightforward. But they also need to be measurable consistently, reliably, and efficiently. And some things like the number of fatalities, that's relatively straightforward to do, you'd think. But when you get to some other metrics, some other things around greenhouse gas emissions, that's where you start to, whether we can put in processes within Shell to do it consistently, reliably, and efficiently is one challenge, particularly when you're trying to do it across 70 countries, range of different operations, and including in countries where they may not have that same understanding and appreciation of its importance. But it's then the comparability with other companies, because a lot of stakeholders want to do the comparison between companies. And if we're including emission sources that others choose not to, then you start to question and underline the value of the data. But to get on to what really gets them to be effective, and I'll show some examples to illustrate this, they also need to be relevant in terms of aligned to business objectives. So if you've got metrics which are measuring performance, and you're telling people that you need to improve the metric, but you also have other metrics that you're measuring them on, for example, from a finance perspective, and you're telling them that those are important, or operational metrics about on-time deliveries, and you're telling people those are important, and though you don't help with the alignment of how do those objectives come together, then the metrics themselves don't achieve anything. It's got to be linked to a clear strategy and business objectives to make it effective. And you need the right supportive behaviors. You need to give people focus, you need to have the right attention, and you need to create the right culture. So all of these things, it's much more about the strategy rather than just per se, it's simple, you set up the right metrics, you're sorted. It's about how you use those metrics in terms of, and use the data that comes from them to actually help drive performance. And then the last point, which is one which I'll come back to in terms of some of the shift in the metrics that we're looking at. To actually use metrics to inform, you need to have a big enough population of incidents. And the example I'll talk about is, from a fatalities perspective, looking at our fatalities data 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, where you were having 30, 40 fatalities a year, it could tell you something about where you should focus your attention next. Now, fortunately, we're down to only 5 to 7 fatalities over the last few years. Still too many, but it doesn't become the relevant sort of statistical metric anymore. You need to look for other metrics to try and identify and find the place to drive performance improvements if you want to reduce those further. So just to talk a bit more about the safety journey. And the graph in the top right is just showing the red line is the trend on our TRCF, the green on our lost time injury frequency. And both were trending down nicely. This shows from 2004, but if you put it back another 10 years, it was following a similar steady downward trend. What you saw, though, was that the fatal accident rate, which is the blue line that was still going up, 2004, 5, 6, wasn't coming down at the same rate. So we were addressing and reducing the frequency of the more minor incidents, but we weren't making the sort of the step we wanted to of actually reducing the number of fatalities. And that's where we started more on a what we've called our goal zero journey, of really trying to get more precise on what we actually focus on at each point to try and make those step changes in performance. And the first big one I'll talk a bit more about, which was the life-saving rules. So that's where using the data and actually going back and analyzing what were the common causes of fatalities. We got to our 12 life-saving rules, which gave that focus. Then you started to actually get clear about some simple things that you could consistently tell people that weren't acceptable. And what you saw from there is the journey from sort of 2006, as these came in after the introduction, we started to see a sustained, consistent improvement in safety performance. And those types of issues which are in the life-saving rules have moved away from being causes of fatalities. Now we're moving to other things which you sort of get to, which is the less common, less frequent incidents, and then you get to a different sort of behavior. Along the way, we've been doing other things about codifying more clearly what the requirements are with our control framework, and moving now to more, how do you create the HSC leadership, strengthening that culture further around the leaders and the frontline supervisors setting the right tone and examples day in, day out. And that's the sort of the next stage, which I'll come back to talk a bit more about some of the metrics we're moving to next. What we're moving to now is looking for the areas with a sufficient population to make the learnings. And that's where we've looked at high potential incidents and near misses. And we're starting to look at how do you analyze those to find some of the more, the sort of the areas to focus on next. What are the causes that you should look after? And it's all about keeping the focus in the right areas. A few of the other examples. Number and volume of spills and flaring are sort of good examples of metrics that we can actually, you can drive performance because you can apply them consistently across the group, you can measure them quite easily, and by being clear that you want to improve them, it's easy to identify some of the steps you need to do. The one that Matthias referred to, process safety events, is a key focus for us. This is the one which, while we've seen the improvement in fatalities, we're still having too many significant process safety events that cause us concern. And that's our real sort of next focus area from improving safety performance. I mentioned SOx emissions as an example of the sort of thing that you can improve, but actually it tends to be more of a local issue. And if you've got all of the air assets in an area improving it, you can make good improvements. But I'll come back to a couple of other examples on that. And then to get to the sort of the really useful process safety indicators is what we've referred to the tier 3, T4. And these are more the leading indicators that give you indications, some of the things Matthias referred to. The challenge is the number of those that you need to measure is huge. And how do you keep that focus when you get to the much broader range of metrics is one of the things we're grappling with at the moment. So finally, just to sort of come back to some of the challenges, I think this gap between the internal perception of knowing what you need to do to drive and improve performance versus sort of external perception and concern and some of the metrics people think that they want, and the need to actually think about how you do the narrative to explain from that concern externally, what are we doing about it and how does that translate into what are the relevant metrics is our sort of key challenge for a sort of reporting person to help to make that story. We still, on some areas, struggle with how you aggregate local metrics for global reporting. So, for example, community concerns and priorities is an increasing focus area. But when you try and aggregate the concerns with one community to another, you very quickly get to meaningless data. And similarly, water usage. There were some good presentations yesterday talking about how important it is to understand your water usage. But you need to find the right metrics, because if you just measure the water usage, which is one of the ones which we're asked to do, actually reducing your water usage may make no real positive impact at all if you're reducing it in places where water is plentiful rather than at the same time as increasing it by a small amount in somewhere where it's scarce. And then my final point is the importance of governments creating the right enabling environment. And that was where I was getting at with touching on the SOx emissions. You know, we've seen how SOx emissions can come down quite dramatically when you have the right legislation in place that puts the pressure on people and the incentive for all companies to do it. Because if you've got a whole series of factories and you're the only one that's reducing your SOx emissions, it doesn't help. If you've got clear common regulations that create a level playing field, then there's incentive for everybody to do. And that's what we try to push for, because the things we want to do, you can't do unless there's the right enabling environment, because otherwise you very quickly go out of business by becoming the highest cost producer. Okay, thank you very much.